A call from my brother. Hey, I'm streaming right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you're on stream.
Uh-oh. Alright, have a good stream.
Did you have something to say? You can text it.
I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right. Bye bye. I hate this guy so much. Oh, wait, he might see this. Ah! I hate every single one of my family members, especially my aunt. I can't stand her. She's the worst. My mom is even worse than her. And, I don't know. I'm telling lies. What? What? Oh no! She heard! She heard that I hate her! It's just a lie, don't worry. Johnny, Johnny. Shame on you. Shame on you. Start. Jordo says dog. I'll start. I'll try to start the streams with a poem each time to give people time to show up. Here's a fitting one for this chilly November eve. This is The Birds of Passage by Jones Very. The Birds of Passage. Whence comes those many-colored birds that fill with songs each field and bower, when winter's blasts their force have spent, and spring to summer brings her dower? I've watched them, but I know not whence, with voices all attuned they fly. 'Tis from some distant, unknown land, some sunnier clime and fairer sky. And these the notes they bring to tell that of that unseen and distant home, to tempt us who are living here with them when winter comes to roam. Had I but wings I would not stay, when chilling cold I feel him near, but with them journeying there I'd fly, that land, that unknown land of which I hear. I messed up the last line. Last two streams, fairy tales, fables, talking cats, sillies. None of that this time. This time it's a cold, damp November in my soul. So, light a fire. Keep warm. Fire. A useful thing. I have a story about fire. An awful story. Don't burn your finger. Let's burn my hair off. I could use a haircut. I've got my warm tea here in a stop. You can't stop me. Warm tea here in a some sort of creature, some sort of a fat bearded creature here. I don't know what this would be called. Maybe a not quite a goblin. Doesn't look like an elf. What would you call this creature? I want that mug. Try to take it from me. We'll see how well that goes. She says it's called a gnome. How do you decide what poems to pick, or stories for that matter? I decided about 1 minute before the stream that I was going to start streams with a poem. I opened this one up and saw the word winter in that one and knew that I was going, and that's why I picked that poem. stories. Well, for one, I'm pretty sure I have to read things that are in the public domain, or else, big publishers could come after me. They break thumbs, so you don't want to mess with them. Uh, so I pick public domain, but then I also pick stories that either I've read before and I like the one I have for today, or something that I've been meaning to read and I feel like I want to read. I just picked the fairy tales and stuff because I figured that's a good way to start. Kind of simple. And is this stream called is this stream called Bedtime Fairy Tale Story Time? No. That's got to change. Gotta change it to something more interesting. Sorry for the dead air. I know that this is like radio. No dead air, no dead air. Reading Jack London tonight. And no fairy tale. Get that out of the tags. I don't know any other tags, and I don't care to know any other tags. Uh-oh. I have to sneeze. Is there a mute button? There is a mute button. I only have to sneeze slightly, though. It's going to come up right when I start reading the story. That a big sneeze is going to come out and half my brain's going to fall out with it. Brain juice. Gotta get the gas out so I'm not burping during the story. This story is not for the faint of heart. It's not like gory or anything. It's just dark themes. Nature, the cruelty of nature, the insignificance of man before. Is this still called? Okay, no, I did change the stream. The insignificance of man before nature. The uncaring world that we all live in. But it would be really annoying if it cared. Like, imagine if nature was always checking in on you and stuff. That would suck. So, count your blessings that the world is uncaring. Because, that's not true. I care. Well, can you stop a tornado? Can you make me not die? I can. Thanks, Commander. You're always there for me. Let me just throw my tea bag away. Here, I'll wrap it in some TP, and then I'll throw it away later so I don't have to leave the stream. Yep. $7:08. Reading tonight, Jack London's To Build a Fire. I'll give it a minute more. Here, my glasses are fogged up. Hot. It's hard to drink hot tea because I'm such an ice cold killer. Jack London. Anybody know about him? He's an American, I believe. Let's look at his Wikipedia. Let's get a little educational here with Wikipedia. Hack London, more like. That's what I call him. That's what I call him. He's an American author, journalist, and activist. He's not from London. I don't know if Wikipedia is copyright. I don't think so. A pioneer of commercial fiction and American magazines. He was the first American author to become an international celebrity and even earn a large fortune from writing. He's also known as an innovator in the genre that would later become known as science fiction. Well, tonight it's not a science fiction tale, and also innovator, yeah, that doesn't mean much, but there's definitely, don't take that as he invented it or anything. Definitely existed before him. He lived from 1876 to 1916, and Frankenstein was written in 1818 or published in 1818. That's what people consider the first modern science fiction novel. So he definitely didn't invent the genre. While I'd usually prefer to have a physical copy of the books or stories that I'm reading, I don't own a physical copy of To Build a Fire, so I'm going off my phone here. So if anybody wants to mess with me and text me stupid things while I'm streaming here, they can throw me off, see if they can do it. Only a 16-page short story here. We'll see how much time after this story, if there's time to start. Maybe I'll read a little bit of Call of the Wild, and we'll do another Jack London. Call of the Wild being about 80 pages. Let's see. About 90 pages. So that would probably be a two-parter. Start it today, finish it. Not tomorrow. Can't stream tomorrow. But, I suppose we begin with Jack London's To Build a Fire. Cozy up, people. Remember, a useful thing. If you didn't have fire, you would want it. To build a fire. Day had dawned cold and gray when the man turned aside from the main Yukon Trail. He climbed the high earth bank where a little traveled trail led east through the pine forest. It was a high bank, and he paused to breathe at the top. He excused the act to himself by looking at his watch. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. There was no sun or promise of sun, although there was not a cloud in the sky. It was a clear day. However, there seemed to be an indescribable darkness over the face of things. That was because the sun was absent from the sky. This fact did not worry the man. He was not alarmed by the lack of sun. It had been days since he had seen the sun. The man looked along the way he had come. The Yukon lay a mile wide and hidden under 3 feet of ice. On top of this ice were as many feet of snow. It was all pure white. North and south, as far as his eye could see, it was unbroken white. The thing that revealed the whiteness was a thin, dark line that curved from the pine-covered island to the south. It curved into the north, where it disappeared behind another pine-covered island. This dark line was the trail, the main trail. It led south 500 miles to the Chilkoot Pass and salt water. It led north 75 miles to Dawson, and still farther on to the north 1,000 miles to Nulato, and finally to St. Michael on Bering Sea, 1,000 miles and half 1,000 more. But all this, the distant trail, no sun in the sky, the great cold, and the strangeness of it all, had no effect on the man. It was not because he was long familiar with it. He was a newcomer in the land, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was that he was not able to imagine. He was quick and ready in the things of life, but only in the things, and not in their meanings. 50 degrees below zero meant 80 degrees of frost. Such facts told him that it was cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to consider his weakness as a creature affected by temperature, nor did he think about man's general weakness, able to live only within narrow limits of heat and cold. From there, it did not lead him to thoughts of heaven and the meaning of a man's life. 50 degrees below zero meant a bite of frost that hurt, and that must be guarded against by the use of mittens, ear coverings, warm moccasins, and thick socks. 50 degrees below zero was to him nothing more than 50 degrees below zero. That it should be more important than that was a thought that never entered his head. As he turned to go, he forced some water from his mouth as an experiment. There was a sudden noise that surprised him. He tried it again, and again. In the air, before they could fall to the snow, the drops of water became ice that broke with a noise. He knew that at 50 below zero, water from the mouth made a noise when it hit the snow, but this had done that in the air. Undoubtedly it was colder than 50 below, but exactly how much colder he did not know. But the temperature did not matter. He was headed for the old camp on Henderson Creek, where the boys were already. They had come across the mountain from the Indian Creek country. He had taken the long trail to look at the possibility of floating logs from the islands in the Yukon down the river when the ice melted. He would be in camp by 6 o'clock that evening. It would be a little after dark, but the boys would be there, a fire would be burning, and a hot supper would be ready. As he thought of lunch, he pressed his hand against the package under his jacket. It was also under his shirt, wrapped in a handkerchief and lying for warmth against the naked skin. Otherwise the bread would freeze. He smiled contentedly to himself as he thought of those pieces of bread, each of which enclosed a generous portion of cooked meat. He plunged among the big pine trees. The trail was not well marked here. Several inches of snow had fallen since the last sled had passed. He was glad he was without a sled. Actually, he carried nothing but the lunch wrapped in the handkerchief. He was surprised, however, at the cold. It certainly was cold, he decided, as he rubbed his nose and face with his mittened hands. He had a good growth of hair on his face, but that did not protect his nose or the upper part of his face from the frosty air. Following at the man's heels was a big native dog. It was a wolf dog, gray-coated and not noticeably different from its brother, the wild wolf. The animal was worried by the great cold. It knew that this was no time for traveling. Its own feeling was closer to the truth than the man's judgment. In reality, it was not merely colder than 50 below zero, it was colder than 60 below, than 70 below. It was 75 below zero. Because the freezing point is 35 above zero, it meant that there were 107 degrees of frost. The dog did not know anything about temperatures. Possibly in its brain there was no understanding of a condition of very cold, such as in the man's brain, but the animal sensed the danger. Its fear made it question eagerly every movement of the man, as if expecting him to go into camp or to seek shelter somewhere and build a fire. The dog had learned about fire, and it wanted fire. Otherwise it would dig itself into the snow and find shelter from the cold air. The frozen moistness of its breath had settled on its fur in a fine powder of frost. The hair on the man's face was similarly frosted, but more solidly. It took the form of ice and increased with every warm, moist breath from his mouth. Also, the man had tobacco in his mouth. The ice held his lips so tightly together that he could not empty the juice from his mouth. The result was a long piece of yellow ice hanging from his lips. If he fell down, it would break like glass into many pieces. He expected the ice formed by the tobacco juice, having been out twice before when it was very cold, but it had not been as cold as this, he knew. He continued through the level forest for several miles. Then he went down a bank to the frozen path of a small stream. This was Henderson Creek, and he knew he was 10 miles from where the stream divided. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He was traveling at the rate of 4 miles an hour. Thus he figured that he would arrive where the stream divided at 12:30. He decided he would eat his lunch when he arrived there. The dog followed again at his heels, and its tail hanging low as the man started to walk along the frozen stream. The old sled trail could be seen, but a dozen inches of snow covered the marks of the last sleds. In a month no man had traveled up or down that silent creek. The man went steadily ahead. He was not much of a thinker. At that moment he had nothing to think about except that he would eat lunch at the stream's divide, and that at 6 o'clock he would be in a camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to, and had there been, speech would not have been possible because of the ice around his mouth. Once in a while the thought repeated itself that it was very cold, and that he had never expected such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his face and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did this without thinking, frequently changing hands. But, with all his rubbing, the instant he stopped, his face and nose became numb. His face would surely be frozen. He knew that, and he was sorry that he had not worn the sort of nose guard Bud wore when it was cold. Such a guard passed across the nose and covered the entire face, but it did not matter much, he decided. What was a little frost? A bit painful, that was all. It was never serious. Empty as the man's mind was of thought, he was most observant. He noticed the changes in the creek, the curves and the bends, and always he noted where he placed his feet. Once, coming round a bend, he moved suddenly to the side, like a frightened horse. He curved away from the place where he had been walking and retraced his steps several feet along the trail. He knew the creek was frozen to the bottom. No creek could contain water in that winter. But he knew also that there were streams of water that came out from the hillsides and ran along under the snow and on top of the ice of the creek. He knew that even in the coldest weather these streams were never frozen, and he also knew their danger. They hid pools of water under the snow that might be 3 inches deep or 3 feet. Sometimes a skin of ice half an inch thick covered them, and in turn was covered by the snow. Sometimes there was both water and thin ice, and when a man broke through he could get very wet. That was why he jumped away so suddenly. He had felt the ice move under his feet. He had also heard the noise of the snow-covered ice breaking, and to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. At the very least it meant delay, because he would be forced to stop and build a fire. Only under its protection could he bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. He stood and studied the creek bottom and its banks. He decided that the flowing stream of water came from the right side. He thought a while, rubbing his nose and face. Then he walked to the left. He stepped carefully and tested the ice at each step. Once away from the danger, he continued at his 4-mile pace. During the next 2 hours, he came to several similar dangers. Usually the snow above the pools had a sunken appearance. However, once again he came near to falling through the ice. Once, sensing danger, he made the dog go ahead. The dog did not want to go. It hesitated until the man pushed it forward. Then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly it fell through the ice, but climbed out on the other side, which was firm. It had wet its feet and legs. Almost immediately, the water on them turned to ice. The dog made quick efforts to get the ice off its legs. Then it lay down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that had formed between its toes. The animal knew enough to do this. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the commands that arose from the deepest part of its being. But the man knew these things, having learned them from experience. He removed the mitten from his right hand and helped the dog tear out the pieces of ice. He did not bare his fingers more than a minute, and was surprised to find that they were numb. It certainly was cold. He pulled on the mitten quickly and beat the hand across his breast. At 12 o'clock the day was at its brightest, yet the sun did not appear in the sky. At 12:30, on the minute, he arrived at the divide of the creek. He was pleased at his rate of speed. If he continued, he would certainly be with the boys by 6 o'clock that evening. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and pulled forth his lunch. The action took no more than a quarter of a minute, yet in that brief moment the numbness touched his bare fingers. He did not put the mitten on, but instead stuck the finger inside his leg. There he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The pain that followed the striking of his fingers across the leg ceased so quickly that he was frightened. He had not had time to take a bite of his lunch. He struck the fingers repeatedly and returned them to the mitten. Then he bared the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice around his mouth prevented him. Then he knew what was wrong. He had forgotten to build a fire and warm himself. He laughed at his own foolishness. As he laughed, he noted the numbness in his bare fingers. Also, he noted that the feeling which had first come to his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether the toes were warm or whether they were numb. He moved them inside the moccasins and decided that they were numb. He pulled the mitten on hurriedly and stood up. He was somewhat frightened. He stamped forcefully until the feeling returned to his feet. It certainly was cold, was his thought. That man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in this country, and he had laughed at him at the time. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He walked a few steps, stamping his feet and waving his arms, until reassured by the returning warmth. Then he took some matches and proceeded to make a fire. In the bushes, the high water had left a supply of sticks. From here he got wood for his fire. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire. Bending over the fire, he first melted the ice from his face. With the protection of the fire's warmth, he ate his lunch. For the moment, the cold had been forced away. The dog took comfort in the fire, lying at full length close enough for warmth and far enough away to escape being burned. When the man had finished eating, he filled his pipe with tobacco and had a comfortable time with the smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled his cap firmly about his ears, and started along the creek trail toward the left. The dog was sorry to leave and looked toward the fire. This man did not know cold. Possibly none of his ancestors had known cold, real cold. But the dog knew, and all of its family knew. And it knew that it was not good to walk outside in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie in a hole in the snow and wait for this awful cold to stop. There was no real bond between the dog and the man. The one was the slave of the other. The dog made no effort to indicate its fear to the man. It was not concerned with the well-being of the man. It was for its own sake that it looked toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of a whip in his voice. So the dog started walking close to the man's heels and followed him along the trail. The man put more tobacco in his mouth and started a new growth of yellow ice on his face. Again his moist breath quickly powdered the hair on his face with white. He looked around him. There did not seem to be so many pools of water under the snow on the left side of Henderson Creek, and for half an hour the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At a place where there were no signs, the man broke through. It was not deep. He was wet to the knees before he got out of the water to the firm snow. He was angry and cursed his luck aloud. He had hoped to get into camp with the boys at 6 o'clock, and this would delay him an hour. Now he would have to build a fire and dry his moccasins and socks. This was most important at that low temperature. He knew that much. So he turned aside to the bank, which he climbed. On top, under several small pine trees, he found some firewood, which had been carried there by the high water of last year. There were some sticks, but also larger branches, and some dry grasses. He threw several large branches on top of the snow. This served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from dying in the wet snow. He made a flame by touching a match to a small piece of tree bark that he took from his pocket. This burned even better than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with pieces of dry grass and with the smallest dry sticks. He worked slowly and carefully, realizing his danger. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, he increased the size of the sticks with which he fed it. He sat in the snow, pulling the sticks from the branches under the trees and feeding them directly to the flame. He knew he must not fail. When it is 75 below, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. This is especially true if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile to keep his blood moving, but the blood in wet and freezing feet cannot be kept moving by running when it is 75 degrees below. No matter how fast he runs, the feet will freeze even harder. All this the man knew. The old man on Sulphur Creek had told him about it, and now he was grateful for the advice. Already all feeling had gone from his feet. To build the fire he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly become numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pushing the blood to all parts of his body, but the instant he stopped, the action of the heart slowed down. Now he received the full force of the cold. The blood of his body drew back from it. The blood was alive like the dog. Like the dog, it wanted to hide and seek cover away from the fearful cold. As long as he walked 4 miles an hour, The blood rose to the surface, but now it sank down to the lowest depths of his body. His feet and hands were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze first. His bare fingers were numb, although they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and face were already freezing, while the skin of all his body became cold as it lost its blood. But he was safe. Toes and nose and face would be only touched by the frost, because the fire was beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it with sticks the size of his finger. In another minute he would be able to feed it with larger branches. Then he could remove his wet moccasins and socks. While they dried, he would keep his naked feet warm by the fire, rubbing them first with snow. The fire was a success. He was safe. He remembered the advice of the old man on Sulphur Creek and smiled. The man had been very serious when he said that no man should travel alone in that country after 50 below zero. Well, here he was. He had had the accident, he was alone, and he had saved himself. Those old men were rather womanish, he thought. All a man must do was to keep his head, and he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone, but it was surprising, the rapidity with which his face and nose were freezing, and he had not thought his fingers could lose their feeling in so short a time. Without feeling they were, because he found it very difficult to make them move together to grip a stick. They seemed far from his body and from him. When he touched a stick, he had to look to see whether or not he was holding it. All of which mattered little. There was the fire, promising life with every dancing flame. He started to untie his moccasins. They were coated with ice. The thick socks were like iron almost to the knees. The moccasin strings were like ropes of steel. For a moment he pulled them with his unfeeling fingers. Then, realizing the foolishness of it, he grasped his knife. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his own fault. Or instead, his mistake. He should not have built the fire under the pine tree. He should have built it in an open space. But it had been easier to pull the sticks from the bushes and drop them directly on the fire. Now the tree under which he had done this excuse me. Now the tree under which he had done this carried a weight of snow on its branches. No wind had been blowing for weeks, and each branch was heavy with snow. Each time he pulled a stick, he shook the tree slightly. There had been just enough movement to cause the awful thing to happen. High up in the tree, one branch dropped its load of snow. This fell on the branches beneath. This process continued, spreading through the whole tree. The snow fell without warning upon the man and the fire was dead. Where it had burned was a pile of fresh snow. The man was shocked. It was like hearing his own judgment of death. For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. Then he grew calm. Perhaps the old man on Sulphur Creek was right. If he had a companion on the trail, he would be in no danger now. If the companion could have built the fire. Now he must build the fire again, and this second time he must not fail. Even if he succeeded, he would be likely to lose some toes. His feet must be badly frozen by now, and there would be some time before the second fire was ready. Such were his thoughts, but he did not sit and think them. He was busy all the time they were passing through his mind. He made a new foundation for a fire, this time in the open space where no tree would be above it. Next he gathered dry grasses and tiny sticks. He could not bring his fingers together to pull them out of the ground, but he was able to gather them by the handful. In this way he also got many pieces that were undesirable, but it was the best he could do. He worked carefully, even collecting an armful of the larger branches to be used later when the fire gathered strength. And all the while the dog sat and watched him. There was an anxious look in its eyes, because it depended upon him as the fire provider, and the fire was slow in coming. When all was ready, the man reached in his pocket for a second piece of tree bark. He knew the bark was there, although he could not feel it with his fingers. He tried again and again, but he could not grasp it. And all the time in his mind he knew that each instant his feet were freezing. This thought alarmed him, but he fought against it and kept calm. He pulled on his mittens with his teeth and began swinging his arms. Then he beat his hands with all his strength against his side. He did this while he was sitting down. Then he stood up to do it. All the while the dog sat in the snow, its tail curled warmly over its feet, and its sharp wolf ears bent forward as it looked at the man. And the man, as he waved his arms and hands, looked with longing at the creature that was warm and secure in the covering provided by nature. After a time he began to notice some feeling in his beaten fingers. The feeling grew stronger until it became very painful, but the man welcomed the pain. He pulled the mitten from his right hand and grasped the tree bark from his pocket. The bare fingers were quickly numb again. Next he brought out his pack of matches, but the awful cold had already driven the life out of his fingers. In his effort to separate one match from the others, the whole pack fell in the snow. He tried to pick it out of the snow, but failed. The dead fingers could neither touch nor hold. Now he was very careful. He drove the thought of his freezing feet and nose and face from his mind. He devoted his whole soul to picking up the matches. He followed the movements of his fingers with his eyes, using his sense of sight instead of that of touch. When he saw his fingers on each side of the pack, he closed them. That is, he willed to close them, because the fingers did not obey. He put the mitten on the right hand again, and beat it fiercely against his knee. Then, with both mittened hands, he lifted up the pack of matches, along with much snow, to the front of his jacket, but he had gained nothing. After some struggling, he managed to get the pack between his mittened hands. In this manner he carried it to his mouth. The ice broke as he opened his mouth with a fierce effort. He used his upper teeth to rub across the pack in order to separate a single match. He succeeded in getting one, which he dropped on his jacket. His condition was no better. He could not pick up the match. Then he thought how he might do it. He picked up the match in his teeth and drew it across his leg. 20 times he did this before he succeeded in lighting it. As it flamed, he held it with his teeth to the tree bark, but the burning smell went up his nose, causing him to cough. The match fell into the snow, and the flame died. The old man on Sulphur Creek was right, he thought in the moment of controlled despair that followed. After 50 below, a man should travel with a companion. He beat his hands, but failed to produce any feeling in them. Suddenly he bared both hands, removing the mittens with his teeth. He caught the whole pack of matches between his hands. His arm muscles were not frozen, and he was able to press the hands tightly against the matches. Then he drew the whole pack along his leg. It burst into flame, 70 matches at once. There was no wind to blow them out. He kept his head to one side to escape the burning smell, and held the flaming pack to the tree bark. As he so held it, he noticed some feeling in his hand. The flesh was burning. He could smell it. The feeling developed into pain. He continued to endure it. He held the flame of the matches to the bark that would not light with flame. Finally, when he could endure no more, he pulled his hands apart. The flaming matches fell into the snow, but the tree bark was burning. He began laying dry grasses and the tiniest sticks on the flame. He could not choose carefully, because they must be pieces that could be lifted with his hands. Small pieces of green grass stayed on the sticks, and he bit them off as well as he could with his teeth. He treated the flame carefully. It meant life. He must not cease. The blood had left the surface of his body, and he now began to shake from the cold. A large piece of a wet plant fell on the little fire. He tried to push it out with his fingers. His shaking body made him push it too far, and he scattered the little fire over a wide space. He tried to push the burning grasses and sticks together again. Even with the strong effort that he made, his trembling fingers would not obey, and the sticks were hopelessly scattered. Each stick smoked a little and died. The fire provider had failed. As he looked about him, his eyes noticed the dog sitting across the ruins of the fire from him. It was making uneasy movements, slightly lifting one foot and then the other. The sight of the dog put a wild idea into his head. He remembered the story of a man caught in a storm and who killed the animal and sheltered himself inside the dead body and thus was saved. He would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until feeling returned to them. Then he could build another fire. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal. Something was wrong, and it sensed danger. It knew not what danger, but somewhere in its brain arose a fear of the man. It flattened its ears at the sound of the man's voice. Its uneasy movements and the liftings of its feet became more noticeable, but it would not come to the man. He got down on his hands and knees and went toward the dog, but the unusual position again excited fear, and the animal moved away. The man sat in the snow for a moment and struggled for calmness. Then he pulled on his mittens, using his teeth, and then stood on his feet. He glanced down to assure himself that he was really standing, because the lack of feeling in his feet gave him no relation to the earth. His position, however, removed the fear from the dog's mind. When he commanded the dog with his usual voice, the dog obeyed and came to him. As it came within his reach, the man lost control. His arms stretched out to hold the dog, and he experienced real surprise when he discovered that his hands could not grasp. There was neither bend nor feeling in his fingers. He had forgotten for the moment that they were frozen and that they were freezing more and more. All this happened quickly, and before the animal could escape, he encircled its body with his arms. He sat down in the snow, and in this fashion held the dog while it barked and struggled. But it was all he could do. Hold its body encircled in his arms and sit there. He realized that he could not kill the dog. There was no way to do it. With his frozen hands he could neither draw nor hold his knife, nor could he grasp the dog around the throat. He freed it, and it dashed wildly away, still barking. It stopped 40 feet away and observed him curiously. with ears sharply bent forward. The man looked down at his hands to locate them and found them hanging at the end of his arms. He thought it curious that it was necessary to use his eyes to discover where his hands were. He began waving his arms, beating the mittened hands against his sides. He did this for 5 minutes. His heart produced enough blood to stop his shaking, but no feeling was created in his hands. A certain fear of death came upon him. He realized that it was no longer a mere problem of freezing his fingers or toes, or of losing his hands and feet. Now it was a problem of life and death, with the circumstances against him. The fear made him lose control of himself, and he turned and ran along the creek bed on the old trail. The dog joined him and followed closely behind. The man ran blindly in fear such as he had never known in his life. Slowly, as he struggled through the snow, he began to see things again. The banks of the creek, the bare trees, and the sky. The running made him feel better. He did not shake any more. Maybe if he continued to run, his feet would stop freezing. Maybe if he ran far enough, he would find the camp and the boys. Without doubt, he would lose some fingers and toes and some of his face, but the boys would take care of him and save the rest of him when he got there. At the same time, there was another thought in his mind that said he would never get to the camp and the boys. It told him that it was too many miles away, and that the freezing had too great a start, and that he would soon be dead. He pushed this thought to the back of his mind and refused to consider it. Sometimes it came forward and demanded to be heard, but he pushed it away and tried to think of other things. It seemed strange to him that he could run on feet so frozen that he could not feel them when they struck the earth and took the weight of his body. He seemed to be flying along the surface and to have no connection with the earth. His idea of running until he arrived at the camp and the boys presented one problem. He lacked the endurance. Several times he caught himself as he was falling. Finally, he dropped to the ground, unable to stop his fall. When he tried to rise, he failed. He must sit and rest, he decided. Next time he would merely walk and keep going. As he sat and regained his breath, he noted that he was feeling warm and comfortable. He was not shaking. It even seemed that a warm glow had come to his body. And yet, when he touched his nose or face, there was no feeling. Running would not bring life to them, nor would it help his hands and feet. When the thought came to him that the frozen portions of his body must be increasing, he tried to keep this thought out of his mind and to forget it. He knew that such thoughts caused a feeling of fright in him, and he was afraid of such feelings. But the thought returned and continued until he could picture his body totally frozen. This was too much, and again he ran wildly along the trail. Once he slowed to a walk, but at the thought that the freezing of his body was increasing made him run again. And all the time the dog ran with him, at his heels. When he fell a second time, the dog curled its tail over its feet and sat in front of him, facing him, curiously eager. The warmth and security of the animal angered him. He cursed it until it flattened its ears. This time the shaking because of the cold began more quickly. He was losing his battle with the frost. It was moving into his body from all sides. This thought drove him forward, but he ran no more than 100 feet when he fell head first. It was his last moment of fear. When he had recovered his breath and his control, he sat and thought about meeting death with dignity. However, the idea did not come to him in exactly this manner. His idea was that he had been acting like a fool. He had been running around like a chicken with its head cut off. He was certain to freeze in his present circumstances, and he should accept it calmly. With this newfound peace of mind came the first sleepiness. A good idea, he thought, to sleep his way to death. Freezing was not as bad as people thought. There were many worse ways to die. He pictured the boys finding his body the next day. Suddenly he saw himself with them, coming along the trail and looking for himself. And still with them, he came around a turn in the trail and found himself lying in the snow. He did not belong with himself any more. Even then he was outside of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow. It certainly was cold, was his thought. When he returned to the United States, he could tell the folks what real cold was. His mind went from this to the thought of the old man of Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly, warm and comfortable, and smoking a pipe. "You were right, old fellow, you were right," he murmured to the man of Sulphur Creek. Then the man dropped into what seemed to him most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting. The brief day ended in a long evening. There were no signs of a fire to be made. Never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. As the evening grew darker, its eager longing for the fire mastered it. With much lifting of its feet, it cried softly, and it flattened its ears, expecting the man's curse, but the man remained silent. Later, the dog howled loudly, and still later, it moved close to the man and caught the smell of death. This made the animal back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leapt and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and ran along the trail toward the camp it knew, where there were the other food providers and fire providers. The end. Yeah, that's an intense one. That's quite the intense story there. Horror story is right. Oh, that's a horrible story. I don't know why I would read such an awful thing. Jack London is an evil man for thinking of that. I don't know how he smelled death on him. He'd surely be frozen. There's no way he would decompose in that temperature. Jack London's a hack. Hack London. Just kidding. That's a very good short story. Very good short story. One of my favorites, even though it's awful. Ooh. That's a cat thing to eat their masters. My cat tries to eat me, even though I'm not dead. So I beat him to it, and I had him for dinner tonight. Man. That story makes me want to go learn how to build a fire. Something I should do on stream eventually. Probably not a good idea to do it right now. Well, it would burn my house down. Hi, kitty. I got a creaky chair here. Hmm. 8 o'clock. Can't stop. Yeah, it really is like Jack Nicholson. It'll burn your finger. Probably burn more than that if I burn my house down. But it's a useful thing to have, fire. Easy to take for granted. But it could save your life one day. So simple for me with my working fingers. My face not frozen. So simple, just a click. And there you go, a flame. What that man would have given for that as he died, cold and alone. Can't live without warmth. You can't live with too much warmth either. Well, like he said, a real man travels alone. A real man don't need nobody. Yeah, that sort of thing can get you killed real quick. Another Jack London story here. I think I'll start it. The Call of the Wild. This one's written from the dog's perspective, I think. I never, yeah. Buck, the dog. Let me finish my tea here. It's kind of cold now. Lukewarm. The boys sitting at their camp. Probably a growing sense of worry among them. And then dread as night fell, I imagine. Or maybe they thought he just camped out and the next day they went and looked for him. Doubt they would have found him, though. He was running wildly at the end there. Like a madman. Running around. Like, I don't know why. Did he say something about Hermes? It always makes me think of Hermes. I don't remember why. Why I associate that particular running with the running god. Earl Grey tea here. I hope everybody's in a comfortable position. I'm out of fire. I'm gonna die. The Call of the Wild here. Hack London. Probably get about halfway through this tonight. Let's see how many parts it is. 7 parts. Into the Primitive. The Law of Club and Fang. I had to get an icy, yeah. Everybody sip a Slurpee, eat an ice cream sandwich. Go get a nice tall glass of cool lemonade with ice. That'd be a good summertime story to read. That's a real beach read, that short story. I don't know. I have not read Call of the Wild on this one. I had read that short story before a few times because I like it. But I have not read this one before. In 7 parts here. Into the Primitive, The Law of Club and Fang, The Dominant Primordial Beast, Who Has Won to Mastership, The Toil of Trace and Trail, For the Love of a Man, and the sounding of the call. Warm sake, yeah. I hope everybody's drunk. I know I can't go one day without a fifth of vodka in my veins. I'm a complete alcoholic. No, just kidding about that. I bone sober here. Well, not to say I don't drink ever, but that entire short story is literally man's hubris, both singular and referring to humankind, in decimating is decimated by the reality of nature. Absolutely right. The man thought he didn't understand the realities of his situation until it was much too late. He thought he didn't understand the world is a place that does not care for his perspective on things. It just is what it is. Oh, great authors are drunks. I don't know if Jack London... Oh, yeah, Jack London was a drunk. He absolutely was, now that I think about it. I think he beat his wife, too. He, liquor keeps a person warm. I think that's a myth. They do send the dogs up with the little... But I don't think it actually helps much if you just... I don't think that it would have saved that guy if he started drinking. It would thin your blood, so it'd probably freeze even faster. Yeah, Jack London was a drunk, now that I think of it. He absolutely was. I'm not on liquor, I promise. Liquor makes you feel warm, but technically it's worse for you since your blood moves to the surface of your skin. Yeah. It's okay. I think that they mostly send the dogs up because if the dog has found you, you're pretty much already saved. They can get you or something. So it's just about feeling good for the moment so you can kind of mentally survive the trek. I don't know. Maybe it's just I don't know. I don't even know if they really do that. I've only seen it in cartoons, like Looney Tunes. The Saint Bernards with the big kegs of alcohol on them. For all I know, that's not a real thing. Almost all of my perception of reality is just based on like Looney Tunes. Real talk, if I've just survived being buried alive in an avalanche for like 16 hours, I would need a drink. Yeah, probably. Probably one of the times I don't think anybody would blame you if you went and got a little drunk after that one. Yeah. I don't blame you on that one. It's for the dog. Yeah. Dogs, if I found a rescue dog, I'd probably be so hungry that I would eat it, and then nobody would know where I am. You know me, I'm not an alkie, but I got a belly here. You think the dog in Call of the Wild is a drunk? Well, we'll find out if Buck, the dog hero of the Call of the Wild, is a drunk. We'll find out here as I start the Call of the Wild. The Call of the Wild by Jack London. There's an introduction here, but the introduction is not no eating dog. Hey, in an emergency situation, I'm going to eat a dog. I'm not going to like it, but if it's me starving to death or the dog, I'm going to eat the dog. I'm not going to eat a dog in anything other than an emergency situation, unless it was prepared well, like a master chef prepared it or something. Then I'd eat a dog. But I wouldn't like it. I wouldn't like that it's a dog, especially if they told me its name and showed me pictures of it and let me pet it beforehand. Define emergency. Like I'm hungry. Like I haven't eaten for like 5 minutes or something. I don't have any chips. Could I eat Willow the dog? Willow's too small, and Willow is like a little chicken wing. I don't know. I'd be like, and Willow would be gone. Willow the dog is a small little white dog. White. Sorry, I'm racist towards white people. Whoa, Shih Tzu? Come on, don't swear. Lao Tzu, more like. Well, Call the Wild here starts with a, is it epigram or epigraph? What epigraph, I think. It starts off with a quotation. Well, part one, into the primitive. You're funny. Wrong you're. Old longings, nomadic leap, chafing at custom's chain, again from its brimmal sleep wakens the ferine strain. Okay, there were like 2 words there I didn't know. Or 3 words. No, just 2. Let's see what Burmal means so we can all learn something new today. Burmal. Brumal. Let's see what Brumal. This is a Brumal. Is this about Harrison Ford? Did Harrison Ford do a movie version of this? I thought this was a dog. Did he play a dog? Did Harrison Ford play a dog? Brumal. It's a literary show. It's about learning words, about words strung together, and he played Air Bud in Air Bud. There's nothing in the rule books that says a man can't play a dog. Now, Brumal means relating to winter or wintry. Brumal. Gonna have to start up a list of the words I don't know here. Or the words. If anybody doesn't know a word that I say, type it up in chat there and we can look it up. If anybody ever, if you're interested, because this is a learning show. It's an educational show. It's about learning, and it's never bad to learn anything. I'm not one of those people who says you should obsessively learn things. They adapted Call the Wild into a movie, and he's in it. I thought I remembered that. Silly. Kind of silly. I don't know. Maybe it's a good movie. I haven't seen it, but if he plays a dog, I don't know. I don't really care to see Indiana Dog. If you say a word I don't know, I'm going to take a drink. I'm making a drinking game out of it. I wouldn't recommend it. Oh, actually, if you're going to do that, I'll just go get like my Russian dictionary or something and just read that out loud. Brumal sleep. And then the other word I didn't know was ferine. So Brumal means wintry. Now ferine. Ferine. Okay. Ferine. Ferine or ferine maybe? Let's see. Ooh, ferine is wild and menacing. Savage. Feral. You'll be drunk quick. Just kidding. So now that we know what Brumal and ferine mean, I'm going to reread this. You know what? An educational show. I don't remember if it's epigram. I think epigram. Epigraph is like on your tombstone. Epigram, I think, is what this is. A quotation to start a story. But let's see. Let's double check that to make sure. So I'm not giving misinformation here. It's not at all what I said. Oh, no. Yeah, not at all what I said, apparently. Epigram is a pithy saying or remark, expressing an idea in a clever and amusing way. So essentially everything I say is an epigram, since I'm so witty. So it is an epigraph that starts a book. I guess it's also... So I was completely wrong. So an epigram, if anybody is curious, is a witty remark, a retort, one might even say, a witticism. And an epigraph is what starts a work. A quotation that starts a work. It's good to know what words mean. So we don't sound like idiots when we speak and somebody else knows what the word means. Someone needs to keep meeting minutes for this. I don't know what a meeting minute... Oh, I've never worked in an office. I assume it has something to do with meetings. I won't take meetings. I won't go to a meeting. Anybody ever tells me to go to a meeting, and I'll see them at the butcher shop. Steak. Well, now knowing what this epigraph, now knowing all the words in it, let's read that again. Unless anybody doesn't know, I'll look up any word. Old longings nomadic leap, chafing at custom's chain, again from its brumal sleep wakens the ferine strain. I'm going to learn things from this stream. That's the intention. That is the intention. This is supposed to be an educational show. Here, I'm going to learn from Grammarly. Meeting minutes are a written record of a meeting or hearing. Minutes are usually constructed and formal, so they can be shared after the meeting and serve as historical documents in the future. If anybody wants to do that, I will not be doing thusly. I probably will try to keep a running log somewhere of the words that I didn't know. I do that already with when I'm reading books. If I don't know a word, I keep note of it, and then I keep a list of those words so I can go back and try to know them better. But yes, if anybody ever comes across a word they want to know, we can do it together so that we remember it more. Because once the word becomes so unknown, once it becomes 70 below, you shouldn't look it up alone. I think I'm going to read, at least try to get the first 2 or 3 sections of Call of the Wild, and probably just 2. Call of the Wild, Section 1. Into the Primitive. Old longings nomadic leap, chafing at custom's chain. Again from its brumal sleep wakes the ferine strain. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, not alone for himself, but for every tide-water dog, strong of muscle and with warm long hair, from Puget South to San Diego, because men, groping in the Arctic darkness, had found a yellow metal, and because steamship and transportation companies were booming the find, thousands of men were rushing into the Northland. These men wanted dogs, and the dogs they wanted were heavy dogs with strong muscles, by which to toil, and furry coats to protect them from the frost. Buck lived at a big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. Judge Miller's place, it was called. It stood back from the road, half hidden among the trees, through which glimpses could be caught of the wild, cool veranda that ran around its 4 sides. The house was approached by graveled driveways which wound about through wide spreading lawns and under the interlacing boughs of tall poplars. Boughs, not bows. At the rear, things were on even a more spacious scale than at the front. There were great stables where a dozen grooms and boys held forth, rows of vine-clad servants' cottages, an endless and orderly array of outhouses, long grape arbors, green pastures, orchards, and berry patches. Then was the pumping plant for the artisan well, and the big cement tank where Judge Miller's boys took their morning plunge and kept cool in the hot afternoon. And over this great demise, I don't know this word, Buck ruled. Demnes, Buck ruled. Here he was born, and here he had lived for the 4 years of his life. It was true there were other dogs. There could not but be other dogs on so vast a place, but they did not count. They came and went, resided in the populous kennels, or lived obscurely in the recesses of the house, after the fashion of Toots, the Japanese pug, or Yasbel, the Mexican hairless. Strange creatures that rarely put nose out of doors or set foot to ground. On the other hand, there were the fox terriers, a score of them at least, who yelped fearful promises at Toots and Isabel, looking out of the windows at them, and protected by a legion of housemaids armed with brooms and mops. But Buck was neither house dog nor kennel dog. The whole realm was his. He plunged into the swimming tank or went hunting with the judge's sons. He escorted Molly and Alice, the judge's daughters, on long twilight or early morning rambles. On wintry nights he lay at the judge's feet before the roaring library fire. He carried the judge's grandsons on his back or rolled them in the grass, and guarded their footsteps through wild adventures down to the fountain in the stable yard, and even beyond, where the paddocks were, and the berry patches. Among the terriers he stalked imperiously, and Toots and Isabel here utterly ignored, for he was king. King over all creeping, crawling, flying things of Judge Miller's place, humans included. His father, Elmo, a huge St. Bernard, had been the judge's inseparable companion, and Buck bid fair to follow in the way of his father. He was not so large, he weighed only 140 pounds, for his mother, Shep, had been a Scotch shepherd dog. Nevertheless, 140 pounds, to which was added the dignity that comes of good living and universal respect, enabled him to carry himself in right royal fashion. During the 4 years since his puppyhood, he had lived the life of a sated aristocrat. He had a fine pride in himself, was even a trifle egotistical, as country gentlemen sometimes become because of their insular situation. But he had saved himself by not becoming a mere pampered house dog. Hunting and kindred outdoor delights had kept down the fat and hardened his muscles, and to him, as to the cold tubing races, the love of water had been a tonic and a health preserver. And this was the manner of dog Buck was in the fall of 1897, when the Klondike strike dragged men from all the world into the frozen north. But Buck did not read the newspapers, and he did not know that Manuel, one of the gardener's helpers, was an undesirable acquaintance. Manuel had one besetting sin. He loved to play Chinese lottery. Also, in his gambling, he had one besetting weakness, faith in a system. And this made his damnation certain, for to play a system required money, while the wages of a gardener's helper do not lap over the needs of a wife and numerous progeny. The judge was as a meeting of the Raisin Growers Association, and the boys were busy organizing an athletic club on the memorable night of Manuel's treachery. No one saw him and Buck go off through the orchard on what Buck imagined was merely a stroll, and with the exception of a solitary man, no one saw them arrive at the little flag station known as College Park. This man talked with Manuel, and money chinked between them. "You might wrap up the goods before you deliver 'em," the stranger said gruffly, and Manuel doubled a piece of stout rope around Buck's neck under the collar. "Twist it and you'll choke 'em plenty," said Manuel, and the stranger grunted a ready affirmative. Buck had accepted the rope with quiet dignity. To be sure, it was an unwonted performance, but he had learned to trust in men he knew and to give them credit for a wisdom that outreached his own. But when the ends of the rope were placed in the stranger's hands, he growled menacingly. He had merely intimated his displeasure in his pride, believing that to intimate was to command. But to his surprise, the rope tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath. In quick rage, he sprang at the man, who met him halfway, grappled him close by the throat, and with a deft twist threw him over on his back. Then the rope tightened mercilessly, while Buck struggled in a fury, his tongue lolling out of his mouth and his great chest panting futilely. Never in all his life had he been so vilely treated, and never in all his life had he been so angry. But his strength ebbed, his eyes glazed, and he knew nothing when the train was flagged and the two men threw him into the baggage car. The next he knew, he was dimly aware that his tongue was hurting and that he was being jolted along in some kind of conveyance. The hoarse shriek of a locomotive whistling a crossing told him where he was. He had traveled too often with the judge not to know the sensation of riding in a baggage car. He opened his eyes, and into them came the unbridled anger of a kidnapped king. The man sprang for his throat, but Buck was too quick for him. He closed his jaw on the hand, nor did they relax till his senses were choked out of him once more. "Yep, has fits," the man said, hiding his mangled hand from the baggage man, who had been attracted by the sound of struggle. "I'm taking them for the boss to Frisco. A crack dog doctor there thinks he can cure 'em." Concerning that night's ride, the man spoke most eloquently for himself in a little shed back of a saloon on the San Francisco waterfront. "All I get is 50 for it," he grumbled, "and I won't do it for 1,000 cold cash." His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, and the right trouser leg was ripped from knee to ankle. "How much did the other mug get?" the saloon keeper demanded. 100, was the reply. "Wouldn't take a sou less, so help me." "That makes 150, the saloon keeper calculated, "and he's worth it, or I'm a squarehead." The kidnapper undid the bloody wrappings and looked at his lacerated hand. "If I don't get the hydrophoby, it'll be because you were born to hang," laughed the saloon keeper. "Here, lend me a hand before you pull your freight," he added. Dazed, suffering intolerable pain from throat to tongue, with the life half throttled out of him, Buck attempted to face his tormentors, but he was thrown down and choked repeatedly, till they succeeded in filling the heavy brass collar from till they succeeded in filing the heavy brass collar from off his neck. Then the rope was removed, and he was flung into a cage-like crate. There he lay for the remainder of the weary night, nursing his wrath and wounded pride. He could not understand what it all meant. What did they want with him, these strange men? Why were they keeping him pent up in this narrow crate? He did not know why, but he felt oppressed by the vague sense of impending calamity. Several times during the night he sprang to his feet when the shed door rattled open, expecting to see the judge, or the boys at least. But each time it was the bulging face of the saloon keeper that peered at him by the sickly light of a tallow candle. And each time the joyful bark that trembled in Buck's throat was twisted into a savage growl. But the saloon keeper let him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up the crate. More tormentors, Buck decided, for they were evil-looking creatures, ragged and unkempt. And he stormed and raged at them through the bars. They only laughed and poked sticks at him, which he promptly assailed with his teeth till he realized that that was what they wanted, whereupon he lay down sullenly and allowed the crate to be lifted into a wagon. Then he and the crate in which he was imprisoned began a passage through many hands. Clerks in the express office took charge of him. He was carted about in another wagon. A truck carried him, with an assortment of boxes and parcels, upon a ferry steamer. He was trucked off the steamer into a great railway depot, and finally he was deposited in an express car. For 2 days and nights this express car was dragged along the tail of shrieking locomotives, and for 2 days and nights Buck neither ate nor drank. In his anger, he had met the first advances of the express messengers with growls, and they had retaliated by teasing him. When he flung himself against the bars, quivering and frothing, they laughed at him and taunted him. They growled and barked like detestable dogs, mewed and flapped their arms and crowed. It was all very silly, he knew, but therefore the more outrage to his dignity, and his anger waxed and waxed. He did not mind the hunger so much, but the lack of water caused him severe suffering, and fanned his wrath to fever pitch. For that matter, high-strung and finely sensitive, the ill treatment had flung him into a fever, which was fed by the inflammation of his parched and swollen throat and tongue. He was glad for one thing: the rope was off his neck. That had given him an unfair advantage. That had given them an unfair advantage, but now that it was off, he would show them. They would never get another rope around his neck. Upon that he was resolved. For 2 days and nights he neither ate nor drank, and during those 2 days and nights of torment he accumulated a fund of wrath that boiled ill for whoever first fell foul of him. His eyes turned bloodshot, and he was metamorphosed into a raging fiend. Metamorphosed into a raging fiend. So changed was he that the judge himself would not have recognized him, and the express messengers breathed with relief when they bundled him off the train at Seattle. 4 men gingerly carried the crate from the wagon into a small, high-walled backyard. A stout man with a red sweater that sagged generously at the neck came out and signed the book for the driver. That was the man, Buck divined, the next tormentor, and he hurled himself savagely against the bars. The man smiled grimly and bought a hatchet and a club. "You ain't going to take him out now?" the driver asked. "Sure," the man replied, driving the hatchet into the crate for a pry. There was an instantaneous scattering of the four men who had carried it in, and from safe perches on top of the wall they prepared to watch the performance. Buck rushed at the splintering wood, sinking his teeth into it, surging and wrestling with it. Wherever the hatchet fell on the outside, he was there on the inside, snarling and growling, as furiously anxious to get out as the man in the red sweater was calmly intent on getting him out. "Now, you red-eyed devil," he said, when he had made an opening sufficient for the passage of Buck's body. At the same time he dropped the hatchet and shifted the club to his right hand. And Buck was truly a red-eyed devil, as he drew himself together for the spring, hair bristling, mouth foaming, a mad glitter in his bloodshot eyes. Straight at the man he lurched his 140 pounds of fury, surcharged with the pent passion of 2 days and nights. In mid-air, just as his jaws were about to close on the man, he received a shock that checked his body and brought his teeth together with an agonizing clip. He whirled over, fetching the ground on his back, and sighed. He had never been struck by a club in his life, and did not understand. With a snarl that was part bark and more scream, he was again on his feet and launched into the air. And again the shock came, and he was brought crushingly to the ground. This time he was aware that it was the club, but his madness knew no caution. A dozen times he charged, and as often the club broke the charge and smashed him down. After a particularly fierce blow, he crawled to his feet, too dazed to run. He staggered limply about, the blood flowing from nose and mouth and ears, his beautiful coat sprayed and flecked with bloody slaver. Then the man advanced and deliberately dealt him a frightful blow on the nose. All the pain he had endured was as nothing compared with the exquisite agony of this. With a roar that was almost lion-like in its ferocity, he again hurled himself at the man. But the man, shifting the club from right to left, coolly caught him by the underjaw, at the same time retching downward and backward. Buck described a complete circle in the air, and half of another, then crashed to the ground on his head and chest. For the last time he rushed. The man struck the shrewd blow he had purposefully withheld for so long, and Buck crumpled up and went down, knocked utterly senseless. "He's no slouch at dog breaking, that's what I say," one of the men on the wall cried enthusiastically. "Druther break Caius's any day and twice on Sunday," was the reply of the driver, as he climbed on the wagon and started the horses. Buck's senses came back to him, but not his strength. He lay where he had fallen, and from there he watched the man in the red sweater. "Answers to the name of Buck," the man soliloquized, quoting from the saloon keeper's letter, which had announced the consignment of the crate and contents. "Well, Buck, my boy," he went on in a genial voice, "we've had our little ruction, and the best thing we can do is to let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, and all'll go well, and the goose hangs high. Be a bad dog, and I'll whale the stuffin' out of you. Understand?" As he spoke, he fearlessly patted the head he had so mercilessly pounded, and thought Buck's hair involuntarily bristled at touch of the hand. He endured it without protest. When the man brought him water, he drank eagerly. The latter bolted a generous meal of raw meat, chunk by chunk, from the man's hand. He was beaten, he knew that. But he was not broken. He saw, once for all, that he stood no chance against a man with a club. He had learned the lesson, and in all his life he never forgot it. The club was a the club was a revelation. It was his introduction to the reign of primitive law, and he met the introduction halfway. The facts of life took on a fiercer aspect, and while he faced that aspect uncowed, he faced it with all the latent cunning of his nature aroused. As the days went by, other dogs came in crates and at the ends of ropes, some docilely and some raging and roaring as he had come, and one and all he watched them pass under the domination of the man in the red sweater. Again and again, as he looked at each brutal performance, the lesson was driven home to Buck. A man with a club was a lawgiver, a master to be obeyed, though not necessarily conciliated. Of this last Buck was never guilty, though he did see beaten dogs that fawned upon the man, and wagged their tails and licked his hand. Also he saw one dog that would neither conciliate nor obey, finally killed in the struggle for mastery. Now and again men came, strangers who talked excitedly, wheedlingly, and in all kinds of fashions to the man in the red sweater. And at such times that money passed between them, the strangers took one or more of the dogs away with them. Buck wondered where they went, for they never came back. But the fear of the future was strong upon him, and he was glad each time when he was not selected. Yet his time came in the end, in the form of a little weazened man who spat broken English and many strange and uncouth exclamations which Buck could not understand. "Skirdam!" he cried, when his eyes lit upon Buck. "That one damn bully dog, eh? How much?" 300, and a present at that, was the prompt reply of the man in the red sweater. "And seeing it's government money, you ain't got no kick comin', eh, Perrault?" Perrault grinned, considering that the price of dogs had been boomed skyward by the unwonted demand. It was not an unfair sum for so fine an animal. The Canadian government would be no loser, nor would its dispatches travel the slower. Perrault knew dogs, and when he looked at Buck he knew that he was 1 in 1,000. 1 in 10,000, he commented mentally. Buck saw money pass between them, and was not surprised when Curly, a good-natured Newfoundlander, and he were led away by the little weazened man. That was the last he saw of the man in the red sweater, and as Curly and he looked at receding Seattle from the deck of the Narwhal, it was the last he saw of the warm Southland. Curly and he were taken below by Perrault and turned over to a black-faced giant called Francois. Perrault was a French-Canadian and swarthy, but Francois was a French-Canadian half-breed and twice as swarthy. They were a new kind of men to Buck, of which he was destined to see many more. And while he developed no affection for them, he nonetheless grew honestly to respect them. He speedily learned that Perrault and Francois were fair men, calm and impartial in administering justice, and too wise in the way of dogs to be fooled by dogs. In the 'tween decks of the Narwhal, Buck and Curly joined two other dogs. One of them was a big snow-white fellow from Spitzbergen, who had been brought away by a whaling captain, and who had later accompanied a geological survey into the Barrens. He was friendly, in a treacherous sort of way, smiling into one's face the while he meditated on some underhand trick, as, for instance, when he stole from Buck's food at the first meal. As Buck sprang to punish him, the lash of Francois's whip sang through the air, reaching the culprit first, and nothing remained to Buck but to recover the bone. That was fair of Francois, he decided, and the half-breed began to rise in Buck's estimation. The other dog made no advances, nor received any. Also, he did not attempt to steal from the newcomers. He was a gloomy, morose fellow, and he showed Curly plainly that all he desired was to be left alone, and further, that there would be trouble if he were not left alone. Dave, he was called, and he ate and slept, or yawned between times, and took interest in nothing, not even when the Narwhal crossed Queen Charlotte Sound and rolled and pitched and bucked like a thing possessed. When Buck and Curly grew excited, half wild with fear, he raised his head as though annoyed, favored them with an incurious glance, yawned, and went to sleep again. Day and night the ship throbbed to the tireless pulse of the propeller, and though one day was very like another, it was apparent to Buck that the weather was steadily growing colder. At last, one morning, the propeller was quiet, and the Narwhal was pervaded with an atmosphere of excitement. He felt it, as did the other dogs, and knew that a change was at hand. Francois leashed them and brought them on deck. At the first step upon the cold surface, Buck's feet sank into a white, mushy something very like mud. He sprang back with a snort, more of this white stuff falling through the air. He shook himself, but more of it fell upon him. He sniffed it curiously, then licked some up in his tongue. It bit like fire, and the next instant was gone. This puzzled him. He tried it again with the same result. The onlookers laughed uproariously, and he felt ashamed. He knew not why, for it was his first snow. End of part 1. Oh, poor Buck. Poor Buck. What have you gotten yourself into? This dog. I shouldn't have trusted that Manuel. Oh, now he's up in Canada. A fate worse than death, many say. And even worse, he's in the possession of French Canadians. I mean, I'm not a prejudiced man, but the French offer nothing in this world. That's a lie. I am a prejudiced man against the French. I don't know why it's such a common joke to hate the French nowadays. I don't really hate them. In fact, I quite like them. Here's my little buck. This is my little buck. He's not a big, fierce 140-pound dog, but, I treat him like they've been treating him in the book. The dog is being held by French Canadians. Put that dog out of its misery. I disagree. I think that Francois is a fair master. This is my little buck here. He's a dog. He pretends to be a dog. He was trying to get my attention. I am the man with the club. That's a good job, beating dogs until they obey humans. I don't know why we don't do it like that now. It seems more effective than whatever that dog whisperer is doing. I've never seen that show. For all I know, that is what he does. My kitty here likes to hear me read. He likes to listen to me read. But he doesn't like to be held by me right now. He's going to let out a little meow, I think. I like him. He does not like me. Even though he's evil, I like him. He's a monstrous cat, an evil being. He's even worse than Satan. We need a TV show where it's a guy with a club versus two dog. See who lives. Yeah. I think that I'd watch it. Big T. That's Tai Lung, my little doggy cat. Tai Lung. He's a cutie. He was trying to get... His leg is shaking. He was trying to get my attention while I was reading that. He doesn't like it that when I pay attention to screens more than him. Sorry, kitty. He just woofed at me. Second part here is called The Law of Club and Fang. I'll read this and see how I feel. Maybe read up to part 3. There's 7 parts, so the Call of the Wild here. Definitely going to split this one in 2. Over the next stream, I'll finish this story. Probably going to want to read till part 3 if I'm going to split it in 2. If I stop at part 2, it might end up in 3 parts. We'll see. That's all. None of that matters. Do you feel called to the wild? No, these stories don't really make me feel like I want to go out hiking. They kind of make me glad that I can live inside most of my life pretty comfortably. Pretty miserable conditions out there in the colds of Canada. The last one was about man's hubris. This one is about dogs' ignorance. No, I don't know. Maybe some people hear these things and feel like they want to go camping. I don't know about you guys, but personally, I'd rather be the man in the red sweater. 2. The Law of Club and Fang. Oh, you know what? There was a word in there I didn't know. There's a couple, actually. But there was one I underlined. The Judge. Whenever I hear a story refer to the Judge, it makes me think of Blood Meridian. The Judge. Rest in peace, Cormac McCarthy. He died this summer. Who wrote Blood Meridian. Not going to be able to read that until, I think that came out in the 80s, like 85. Yeah, in 2085 I'll be able to read Domain. So is that just domain? It's just another way to spell Domain. Domain. Well, in the beginning of the story, it said, "Over all this great domain, Buck ruled," which apparently means legal possession of land as one's own. So essentially, an estate or your land is called a domain. Demesne. I want to know what the pronunciation is on that. Domain.
We are looking at
Oh
how
my
to
God.
pronounce this word.
Just say it.
In English,
Just say the word.
designating all the land
Just say
retained
it.
and managed
Say the word.
by a lord of the
Say it.
manor
Say it.
under the feudal system.
Say the word.
How do you go about pronouncing it?
Please.
Domain.
Domain. There we go. Domain. Demesne. Over this great domain, Buck ruled. Another word for the list. Domain. Demesne. I need it. I hate it. I hate it when these things. If your video is called "How to Pronounce This," I think the first word has to be the word that you're trying to pronounce. It's got to be. It drives me crazy when it's not. It drives me mad. Part 2. The Law of Club and Fang. Here's a little ASMR. Another one. Can I go for 3? Nope. Buck's first day at the Dana Beach was like a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. He had been suddenly jerked from his heart of civilization and flung into the cold and flung into the heart of things primordial. No lazy, sun-kissed life was this, with nothing to do but loaf and be bored. Here was neither peace nor rest, nor a moment's safety. All was confusion and action, and every moment life and limb were in peril. There was imperative need to be constantly alert, for these dogs and men were not town dogs and men. They were savages, all of them, who knew no law but the law of club and fang. He had never seen dogs fight as these wolfish creatures fought, and his first experience taught him an unforgettable lesson. It is true, it was a vicarious experience, else he would not have lived to profit by it. Curly was the victim. They were camped near the log store, where she, in her friendly way, made advances to a husky dog the size of a full-grown wolf, though not half so large as she. There was no warning, only a leap in like a flash, a metallic clip of teeth, a leap out equally swift, and Curly's face was ripped open from eye to jaw. It was the wolf manner of fighting, to strike and leap away, but there was more to it than this. 30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the combatants in an instant and silent circle. Buck did not comprehend that silent intentness, nor the eager way with which they were licking their chops. Curly rushed her antagonist, who struck again and leapt aside. He met her next rush with his chest in a peculiar fashion that tumbled her off her feet. She never regained them. This was what the onlooking huskies had waited for. They closed in upon her, snarling and yapping, and she was buried, screaming with agony, beneath the bristling mass of bodies. So sudden was it, and so unexpected, that Buck was taken aback. He saw spits run out of his scarlet tongue in a way he had of laughing, and he saw Francois swinging an axe spring into the mess of dogs. 3 men with clubs were helping him to scatter them. It did not take long. 2 minutes from the time Curly went down, the last of her assailants were clubbed off, but she lay there limp and lifeless in the bloody, trampled snow, almost literally torn to pieces. The swart half-breed standing over her and cursing horribly. The scene often came back to Buck to trouble him in his sleep. So that was the way. No fair play. Once down, that was the end of you. Well, he would see to it that he never went down. Spits ran out his tongue and laughed again, and from that moment Buck hated him with a bitter and deathless hatred. Before he had recovered from the shock caused by the tragic passing of Curly, he received another shock. Francois fastened upon him an arrangement of straps and buckles. It was a harness, such as he had seen the grooms put on the horses at home. And as he had seen horses work, so he was set to work, hauling Francois on a sled to the forest that fringed the valley, and returning with a load of firewood. Though his dignity was sorely hurt by thus being made a draught animal, he was too wise to rebel. He buckled down with a will and did his best, though it was all new and strange. Francois was stern, demanding instant obedience, and by virtue of his whip, receiving instant obedience, while Dave, who was an experienced wheeler, nipped Buck's hindquarters whenever he was in error. Spitz was the leader, likewise experienced, and while he could not always get at Buck, he growled sharp reproof now and again, or cunningly threw his weight in the traces to jerk Buck into the way he should go. Buck learned easily, and under the combination tuition of his 2 mates and Francois made remarkable progress. Ere they returned to camp, he knew enough to stop at "ho," to go ahead at "mush," to swing wide on the bends, and to keep clear of the wheeler when the loaded sled shot downhill at their heels. "Très vert, good dogs," Francois told Perrault. "Dat Buck, him pull like hell. I teach him quick as anything." By afternoon, Perrault, who was in a hurry to be on the trail with his dispatches, returned with 2 more dogs. Billy and Joe, he called them. 2 brothers, and true huskies both. Sons of the one mother, though they were as different as day and night. Billy's one fault was his excessive good nature, while Joe was the very opposite, sour and introspective, with a perpetual snarl and a malignant eye. Buck received them in comradely fashion. Dave ignored them, while Spitz proceeded to thrash first one and then the other. Billy wagged his tail appeasingly, turned to run when he saw that appeasement was of no avail, and cried, still appeasingly, when Spitz's sharp teeth scored his flank. But no matter how Spitz circled, Joe whirled around on his heels to face him, mane bristling, ears laid back, lips writhing and snarling, jaws clipping together as fast as he could snap, and eyes diabolically gleaming. The incarnation of belligerent fear. So terrible was his appearance that Spitz was forced to forego disciplining him. But to cover his own discomfiture, he turned upon the inoffensive and wailing Billy and drove him to the confines of the camp. By evening, Perrault secured another dog, an old husky, long and lean and gaunt, with a battle-scarred face and a single eye which flashed a warning of prowess that commanded respect. He was called Sol-leks, which means the Angry One. Like Dave, he asked nothing, gave nothing, expected nothing, and when he marched slowly and deliberately into their midst, even Spitz left him alone. He had one peculiarity which Buck was unlucky enough to discover. He did not like to be approached on his blind side. Of this offense, Buck was unwittingly guilty, and the first knowledge he had of his indiscretion was when Sol-leks whirled upon him and slashed his shoulder to the bone for 3 inches up and down. Forever after, Buck avoided his blind side, and to the last of their comradeship had no more trouble. His apparent ambition, like Dave's, was to be left alone, though, as Buck was afterward to learn, each of them possessed one other and even more vital ambition. That night, Buck faced the great problem of sleeping. The tent, illuminated by a candle, glowed warmly in the midst of the white plain, and when he, as a matter of course, entered it, both Perrault and Francois bombarded him with curses and cooking utensils, till he recovered from his consternation and fled ignominiously into the outer cold. A chill wind was blowing that nipped him sharply and bit with especial venom into his wounded shoulder. He lay down on the snow and attempted to sleep, but the frost soon drove him shivering to his feet. Miserable and disconsolate, he wandered about among the many tents, only to find that one place was as cold as another. Here and there savage dogs rushed upon him, but he bristled his neck hair and snarled, for he was learning fast, and they let him go his way unmolested. Finally, an idea came to him. He would return and see how his own teammates were making out. To his astonishment, they had disappeared. Again he wandered about through the great camp, looking for them, and again he returned. Were they in the tent? No, that could not be, else he would not have been driven out. Then where could they possibly be? With drooping tail and shivering body, very forlorn indeed, he aimlessly circled the tent. Suddenly the snow gave way beneath his forelegs, and he sank down. Something wriggled under his feet. He sprang back, bristling and snarling, fearful of the unseen and unknown. But a friendly little yelp reassured him, and he went back to investigate. A whiff of warm air ascended to his nostrils, and there, curled up under the snow in a snug ball, lay Billy. He whined placatingly, squirmed and wriggled to show his goodwill and intentions, and even ventured, as a bribe for peace, to lick Buck's face with his warm, wet tongue. Another lesson. So that was the way they did it, eh? Buck confidently selected a spot, and with much fuss and waste effort proceeded to dig a hole for himself. In a trice, the heat from his body filled the confined space, and he was asleep. The day had been long and arduous, and he slept soundly and comfortably, though he growled and barked and wrestled with bad dreams. Nor did he open his eyes till roused by the noises of the waking camp. At first he did not know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. The snow walls pressed him on every side, and a great surge of fear swept through him. The fear of the wild thing for the trap. It was a token that he was harking back through his own life to the lives of his forebearers, for he was a civilized dog, an unduly civilized dog, and of his own experience knew no trap, and so could not of himself fear it. The muscles of his whole body contracted spasmodically. I like that word, spasmodically, and instinctively. The hair on his neck and shoulders stood on end, and with a ferocious snarl he bounded straight up into the blinding day, the snow flying about him in a flashing cloud, ere he landed on his feet and saw the white camp spread out before him, and he knew where he was, and remembered all that had passed from the time he went for a stroll with Manuel to the hole he had dug for himself that night before. A shout from Francois hailed his appearance. "What I say?" The dog driver called to Perrault. "That buck for sure learn quick as anything." Perrault nodded gravely. As courier for the Canadian government, bearing important dispatches, he was anxious to secure the best dogs, and he was particularly gladdened by the possession of Buck. 3 more huskies were added to the team inside an hour, making a total of 9, and before another quarter of an hour had passed, they were in harness and swinging up the trail toward the Daya Canyon. Buck was glad to be gone, and though the work was hard, he found he did not particularly despise it. He was surprised at the eagerness which animated the whole team and which was communicated to him. But still more surprising was the chase wrought in Dave and Sol-leks. They were new dogs, utterly transformed by the harness. All passiveness and unconcern had dropped from them. They were alert and active, anxious that the work should go well, and fiercely irritable with whatever, by delay or confusion, retarded that work. The toil of the traces seemed the supreme expression of their being, and all that they lived for was the only thing in which they took delight. Dave was wheeler or sled dog. Pulling in front of him was Buck. Then came Sol-leks. The rest of the team was strung out ahead, single file to the leader, which position was filled by Spitz. Buck had been purposefully placed between Dave and Sol-leks so that he might receive instruction. Apt scholar that he was, they were equally apt teachers, never allowing him to linger long in error, and enforcing their teaching with their sharp teeth. Dave was fair and very wise. He never nipped Buck without cause, and he never failed to nip him when he stood in need of it. As Francois's whip backed him up, Buck found it to be cheaper to mend his ways than to retaliate. Once, during a brief halt, when he got tangled in the traces and delayed the start, both Dave and Sol-leks flew at him and administered a sound trouncing. The resulting tangle was even worse, but Buck took good care to keep the traces clear thereafter, and ere the day was done, so well had he mastered his work that his mates ceased nagging him. Francois's whip snapped less frequently, and Perrault even honored Buck by lifting up his feet and carefully examining them. It was a hard day's run up the canyon. Those sheep through Sheep Camp, past the scales and the timber line, across glaciers, the snow drifts hundreds of feet deep, and over the great Chilcot Divide, which stands between the salt water and the fresh, and guards forbiddingly the sad and lonely north. They made good time down the chain of lakes which fills the craters of extinct volcanoes, and late that night pulled into the huge camp at the head of Lake Bennett, where thousands of gold seekers were building boats against the break-up of the ice in the spring. Buck made his hole in the snow and slept the sleep of the exhausted just, but all too early was routed out in the cold darkness and harnessed with his mates to the sled. That day they made 40 miles, the trail being packed, but the next day, and for many days to follow, they broke their own trail, worked harder, and made poorer time. As a rule, Perrault traveled ahead of the team, packing the snow with webbed shoes to make it easier for them. Francois, guiding the sled at the G-pole, sometimes exchanged places with him, but not often. Perrault was in a hurry, and he prided himself on his knowledge of ice, which knowledge was indispensable, for the fall ice was very thin, and where there was swift water there was no ice at all. Day after day, for days unending, Buck toiled in the traces. Always they broke camp in the dark, and the first gray of dawn found them hitting the trail with fresh miles reeled off behind them. And always they pitched camp after dark, eating their bit of fish and crawling to sleep into the snow. Buck was ravenous. The pound and a half of sun-dried salmon, which was his ration for each day, seemed to go nowhere. He never had enough, and suffered from perpetual hunger pains. Yet the other dogs, because they weighed less and were born to the life, received a pound only of the fish, and managed to keep in good condition. He swiftly lost the fastidiousness which had characterized his old life. A dainty eater, which he found that his mates finishing first robbed him of his unfinished ration. There was no defending it. While he was fighting off 2 or 3, it was disappearing down the throats of the others. To remedy this, he ate as fast as they, and so greatly did hunger compel him, he was not above taking what did not belong to him. He watched and learned when he saw Pike, one of the new dogs, a clever malingerer and thief, slyly steal a piece of bacon when Perrault's back was turned. He duplicated the performance the following day, getting away with the whole chunk. A great uproar was raised, but he was unsuspected, while Dub, an awkward blunderer who was always getting caught, was punished for Buck's misdeed. This first theft marked Buck as fit to survive in the hostile Northland environment. It marked his adaptability, his capacity to adjust himself to changing conditions, the lack of which would have meant swift and terrible death. It marked further the decay or going to pieces of his moral nature. A vain thing and a handicap in the ruthless struggle for existence. It was all well enough in the Southland, under the law of love and fellowship, to respect private property and personal feelings, but in the Northland, under the law of club and fang, whoso took such things into account was a fool, and in so far as he observed them, he would fail to prosper. Not that Buck reasoned it out. He was fit, that was all, and unconsciously he accommodated himself to the new mode of life. All his days, no matter what the odds, he had never run from a fight. But the club of the man in the red sweater had beaten him into a more fundamental and primitive code. Civilized, he could have died for a moral consideration, say the defense of Judge Miller's riding whip. But the completeness of his decivilization was now evidenced by his ability to flee from the defense of a moral consideration and so save his hide. He did not steal for the joy of it, but because the clamor of his stomach. He did not rob openly, but stole secretly and cunningly, out of respect for club and fang. In short, the things he did were done because it was easier to do them than not to do them. His development or retrogression was rapid. His muscles became hard as iron, and he grew callous to all ordinary pain. He achieved an internal as well as external economy. He could eat anything, no matter how loathsome or indigestible, and, once eaten, the juices of his stomach extracted the least particle of nutriment, and his blood carried it to the farthest reaches of his body, building it into the toughest and stoutest of tissues. Sight and scent became remarkably keen, while his hearing developed such acuteness that in his sleep he heard the faintest sound and knew whether it heralded peace or peril. He learned to bite the ice out with his teeth when it collected between his toes, and when he was thirsty and there was a thick scum of ice over the water hole, he would break it by rearing and striking it with stiff forelegs. His most conspicuous trait was an ability to scent the wind and forecast it a night in advance. No matter how breathless the air when he dug his nest by tree or bank, the wind that later blew inevitably found him to leeward, sheltered and snug. And not only did he learn by experience, but instincts long dead became alive again, and the domesticated generations fell from him. In vague ways he remembered back to the youth of the breed, to the time the wild dogs ranged in packs through the primeval forest and killed their meat as they ran it down. It was no task for him to learn to fight with cut and slash and the quick wolf snap. In this manner had fought forgotten ancestors. They quickened the old life within him, and the old tricks which they had stamped into the hereditary of the breed were his tricks. They came to him without effort or discovery, as though they had been his always, and when, on the still cold nights, he pointed his nose at a star and howled long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors, dead and dust, pointing nose at star and howling down through the centuries and through him. And his cadences were their cadences, the cadences which voiced their woe, and what to them was the meaning of the stillness and the cold and the dark. Thus, as token of what a puppet thing life is, the ancient song surged through him, and he came into his own again. And he came because men had found a yellow metal in the north, and because Manuel was a gardener's helper whose wages did not lap over the needs of his wife and divers small copies of himself. End of part 2. It's almost 9:30. Been going for almost an hour and a half. I think I'll leave it there for now on Call of the Wild. 5 viewers right now, not bad. We were reading some Jack London tonight. Cold November reading. Part 1 and 2 of Call of the Wild. Buck is learning the ways of the North. Let's see where things go from here next time. I've never read a book that has a dog as a main character. There's not many of them. Not many of them. I know there's a Japanese book called I Am a Cat. That's, I think, the exact opposite of this book. Maybe the cat goes into the wild, but I know it starts off with him as pampered as well. Maybe it's the same story. I don't know. I have not read that book. I Am a Cat. Have not read that book yet. I mean to one day. There's not many books with non-human main characters. Kind of an unfilled market. It's hard to write from an animal's perspective, but I like it. I like here. I'm reading this again because I like these lines here. And when on the still cold nights he pointed his nose at a star and howled long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors, dead and dust, pointing nose at star and howling through the centuries and through him. And his cadences were their cadences, the cadences which voiced their woe, and what to them was the meaning of the stillness and the cold and the dark. I like that quite a bit. They need more books with dog main characters for all the dog readers. This doesn't even, unless we humanize the animals. This does not, it humanizes them a little bit, obviously, because it would be completely unintelligible if it was like, short feeling of fear, short feeling of anger. Like, if it was like, it would be boring for the human readers. But, somebody clipped that last quote. I quite like that quote. Just a nice little sentence there. Couple of sentences. Quite nice. Ancestry and instinct. Monkey. That's how human beings feel when we climb trees and stuff. We go, monkey. Any sentence that ends in the word dark, it sort of comes with its own advantage. It sounds cool. Oh man, I'm really enjoying Call of the Wild so far. I don't know about you guys. I haven't read any Jack London aside from the short story To Build a Fire that we started with today. And I always like that short story because it's scary. What allows a book to be in the public domain? I wanted to ask earlier. It has to be published 100 years ago. It takes 100 years for a copyright to run out now because of Disney. I think it started at like 15 years or something, but Disney kept pushing the laws back and back so that Mickey wouldn't become public domain. He's still going to hit it. Like I don't know if they're going to do it again, if they're going to pull another fast one on the people of the United States. But eventually Mickey will be public domain. I don't know why he isn't. When did Steamboat Willie come out? It must have been the early 20s, at least, or the 20s at least. Batman is going to be public domain this decade. Black and White Mickey is in the public domain. Okay, so Black and White Mickey you can get. Yeah, it is really kind of like specific. Yeah, time long. 1928. It really is specific. Like Batman, as in like the comic book, the detective comic book Batman, the one who had a gun. That one is going to be in the public domain in a couple of years. But like Batman the animated series, that doesn't make that public domain just because the comics are now public domain. Yeah, Steamboat Willie, 1928. Steamboat Willie released. It's only a few more years, and then Steamboat Willie will be public domain, assuming that Disney doesn't suddenly extend it to 150 years and ruin my whole streaming career before it even starts, because it starts making me have to read Elizabethan novels only. So I'm sitting here reading an old English, only Chaucer, and on sweat old prose morn when the rain fell through the dirt. Reading like that. Yeah, I don't know. Disney. Uh-oh, is Twitch owned by Disney? All hail Disney. All hail. No, wait, they're owned by Amazon. All hail Amazon, right? Here's a little historical piece for you. Here's a little funny historical story. Let me make sure I got the name right. I think it was Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus. I think, yeah, it was Crassus. The Roman general and statesman. He was very, very rich, the richest man in Rome. This is for all you history buffs out there. And he had a lot of slaves, which is what you had when you were a rich Roman. That was a very big asset at the time, was slaves. Never forget it can come back. Slavery has been a staple in all of human society since the beginning. Come back, I say, in this country. Not to say that the whole world isn't run by slaves pretty much still. If you were to cut away human slavery from society right now, everything would fall apart. Every single thing would fall apart. No company could survive. Speaking out my behind here, but I'm pretty sure it's true. But here's what Crassus did. He would get his slaves and he would walk them around town and look for fires. And when he saw a fire, he would say, "Oh, pay me this much and I'll get my slaves to take these buckets and put out your fire." And if they paid him, he would put out the fire. And if they didn't, I'm telling the story wrong, I think. But no, that's not even what he would do. He would say, "Wow, your house is on fire. I'll buy it from you. I mean, it's on fire. It's not worth much." He wouldn't offer them to put the money on. I'm telling the story completely wrong. He said, "I'll buy it from you right now." Well, it's on fire. I mean, it's not worth much. It's burning down. So he would buy it for a couple silver pieces. And then he would use his slaves to put out the fire. And then he would rebuild it. And that's how he came to own quite a bit of Rome. Was he an arsonist? That would have been good for his business. But that is, I think, that's quite a good way to own quite a bit of property, is go around and just buy burning buildings. Not a good guy, this Crassus. He was one of Caesar's friends before the Civil Wars, I believe, along with Pompey before the Civil Wars, and Caesar and Pompey and Crassus Pompey and Crassus fought Caesar. But just because you're fighting for the Republic doesn't mean you're a good person. By the time Caesar took it over, the Republic was pretty well corrupt. I don't know, this doesn't have anything to do with Jack London. I just felt like telling that story. Here's a funny part. Here's another funny thing. I'm just trying to entertain at this point. Here's a funny part of a book. In Moby Dick, here's a funny story from Moby Dick. The main character, Ishmael, arrives at a tavern, and they tell him, "Oh, we're out of rooms, but we do have one where, there's a bed big enough to fit you. There's only one person in that bed, but that person who you have to share the bed with, they happen to be a cannibal." And so Ishmael said, "Oh, I'm not sharing a bed with a cannibal. I'd rather sleep on this bench here, this hard wooden bench." And so he goes to lay down on the bench, and he just can't get comfortable. So he says, "Oh, okay, I'm gonna try my luck with the cannibal." And he goes to his room and he lays down next to this giant tattooed cannibal, and he's very frightened, and he's trying to sleep very far away from the cannibal, like curled up on the other side of the bed. And he eventually gets himself to sleep. But when he wakes up, he and the cannibal are both just hugging each other like pillows, and they're both they're both wrapped around each other, and they become fast friends after that. It's Ishmael and Queequeg, two of the main characters of the book. I quite like Moby Dick. That's public domain. I'll read that eventually. It's got a lot of words I don't know how to pronounce. It's very it's a difficult novel to read out loud, but eventually I'll try it. One of my favorite novels. Very funny novel. Underestimated how funny it is, but it's hilarious until it's soul crushing. I love Moby Dick. I like books in general. I hope people here also like books, because that's all, well, not all I do, but that is going to be a good portion of it is reading. Hopefully in the future I'll also try with general self-improvement streams, learning, studying different things, learning different pieces of information, sitting down and just studying until me and the chat can fully understand things. This is a self-improvement channel, an educational channel. That's the intention. Well, that was a fun stream, I think. I'm enjoying Call of the Wild. I'll probably get to it on a TLC, the Learning Channel is right. I'll probably get back to Call of the Wild maybe Friday, but probably this weekend, if not then. Probably finish off the next almost 60... What is it? 66 more pages. Evil Spirit is on the last page of this story, so that's a prediction of things to come. Evil spirits are going to haunt the second half of this book. The next part is the dominant primordial beast. So interesting things to come in the Call of the Wild. I want to know how Buck gets out of this one. Good old Buck. I'm quite enjoying this story. I can understand why it's beloved. Definitely the kind of thing. Unironically, I'd read it to my kids. It seems like that kind of story, where it's a sort of a bedtime story for a boy, maybe age, I don't know, 7 to 10 or something. It's a very boyish story, obviously. I don't know. Obviously, women can enjoy it too, but it strikes me as the kind of story that a young boy would enjoy, about nature and dog brutality and all that. I don't know if little girls would like this story as much. Obviously, there's going to be someone out there. Not saying that. I'm speaking in generalizations. But I'm quite enjoying it myself. Alright. Almost 10 o'clock. Time to be getting off to bed. You don't want to spend too much time on the internet. It's a very... there's a lot of distractions on the internet. Go out and get a good night's sleep, and if you have a dog, pet your dog tomorrow. Don't beat it with a club until it obeys you. I'm not going to stop you if you do, but I wouldn't recommend it. One and all, thank you for joining me. I bid you all adieu, good night, rest in peace, sleep well, peace, love, literature. Sleep now. I command thee. Sleep, sleep, sleep. Sleep, sleep.